Thank you, David, and thank you all of the organizers of this very important conference. I came here from the United States not exactly sure what was going to take place, but I'm very, very encouraged by the challenge that David has made and others have made to us to convert a culture of war into a culture of peace, and the idea that the Caribbean nations have not been fighting among each other, but that violence has been imposed. I think that's a very profound understanding, and that gives the people of the Caribbean nations some gravity in demanding that there be a zone of peace, and that will affect the greatest military power on earth, your neighbor to the north. So this conference is extremely timely, and I want to thank everybody again. Coalescing and related, I'm going to try to get through my remarks. Is just 2 pages, but I'm hoping I can finish that quickly so that we can have some discussion. Coalescing and uniting the peace and justice forces in the Caribbean could not come at a more propitious moment. U.S. President Donald Trump's brazen speech to the United Nations General Assembly sharply and directly attacked the UN Charter itself and international law. Trump threatened to start a nuclear war at the United Nations. He threatened to invade sovereign countries at the United Nations, all while standing in the world's premier organization established nearly 3/4 of a century ago to maintain peace. And he was addressing a world audience calling for war. Trump made a qualitative leap, a multi-regime change leap. The United States Peace Council analyzed Trump's speech to the UN and concluded that it has qualitatively changed U.S. policy. Even though previous U.S. presidents led aggressions and threats, for example, in this century alone, the coups and the aggressions against Venezuela's President Chavez in 2002, against Iraqi President Hussein in 2003, against Libyan leader Gaddafi in 2011, against Honduras' Zelaya in 2009. Just a few. These aggressions were generated and overthrows were generated by Trump's 2 immediate predecessors. One of them won a Nobel Peace Prize. We claim this is qualitative, even though regular nuclear war exercises by the U.S. and its allies against North Korea started years before Trump was inaugurated. Leaping beyond, Trump has pulled off the velvet glove to show the mailed fist under it. To the UN, the world, he spoke plainly about military action against Venezuela. He clearly stated he intends to shred the nuclear agreement with Iran, and if you read the news, he's moving forward with that. It's a move that would likely precede another war. He spoke about destabilizing Cuba. Well, we had a slight pause in that President Obama arranged, a minor pause, not a complete pause. The blockade still exists, the sanctions still exist, and the efforts at economic sabotage exist. But he's talking about destabilizing Cuba and openly, not hidden. He openly denied the rights of countries like Venezuela and Cuba to follow a socialist path. As David Commission said, It violates everyone's sovereignty when the United States or Europe says, you can't have the country you want. We can, maybe. Our people can decide, but you can't. Deciding which governments stay and which must go represents long-term U.S. policy, U.S. foreign policy. But Trump blatantly asserted it as the right of the United States. It's now the right of the United States. It was done in the past underhanded. It wasn't acknowledged, or it was written up in the news in a way that made it seem necessary or whatever, or even democratic. But now Trump has said, this is the way we're going to work. He's opened that up. The two greatest existential threats to civilization are industrial civilization scorching the Earth's climate and global nuclear war. These are the themes, resisting these are the themes of this conference. The former, global warming, is incremental and is becoming obvious to billions of people. The latter, however, is still hardly discussed and may strike suddenly. Rather than taking action to abate these threats, the USA under Trump is exacerbating both, making them worse. After Trump's election, the doomsday clock, I don't know if you're aware of this, it's a representative of these two extreme existential dangers that the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists, the scientists who created the nuclear bombs, the atomic bombs in the first place, when they recognized what horror they had brought to the world. The doomsday clock was moved closer to midnight. Now it's 2.5 minutes. Masses of people are resisting the environmental danger. We see that every day. Too few are addressing the nuclear danger. Too few. That's the failure of our peace movements. On the one hand, Trump resolutely refuses to acknowledge that the sequential hurricanes that devastated so many Caribbean islands became so destructive in part because of global warming. The Trump administration not only refuses to reduce extraction and burning of fossil fuels, but steaming directly opposite to the rest of civilization is actually accelerating their exploitation. Only the oil companies profit. The rest of us are going to see devastation, more devastation. And on the other hand, the USA is the major force in the world threatening nuclear war. Not only does the US wave aside its obligations to abide by Article 6 of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty signed in 1970, which calls for negotiating nuclear disarmament, it is lavishing a fortune, 1.2 trillion, not billion, but trillion US dollars, to upgrade its nuclear arsenal, and it's daring other nuclear weapon states to participate in a nuclear arms race. And they are following suit. The United States is #1 in threatening the world, threatening civilization. We're not talking about one country or another. We're talking about all of us, our families, our communities, our ability to survive. Trump told the UN he was prepared to suddenly, illegally, immorally, and despicably annihilate the 25 million people of North Korea. Although the US Secretary of State Tillerson revealed that there were existing diplomatic efforts to actually defuse this war threat and to talk to North Korea, Trump told him it's a waste of time. He keeps on saying this. Don't bother, because we're going to deal with it in another way. Understandably, North Korean leader Kim Jong-un seeks nuclear weapons as the only defense against another imperialist attack to overthrow the state. It may not help. And in fact, I believe that with a madman like Trump in the White House, that North Korea's nuclear weapons might be an incentive. Aggression against North Korea, by intention, by accident, or by mistake, would devastate the Korean peninsula, all the Korean people. It would also likely devastate parts of Japan and all of the islands in that area, all of the nations in that area. China and Russia are neighbors to North Korea. Are they going to stand by and say, you're just going to stop and look at the United States, you're just stopping with North Korea? I mean, it is frightening to think about the United States has surrounded China and Russia with foreign military bases, with anti-ballistic missiles, with naval brigades and armadas and so forth, military bases all along the periphery of Russia and around China. And if the United States starts bombing North Korea, what are those countries going to decide to do? At the UN, Trump continued the verbal assault on Syrian President Assad and the Syrian people, even while the US military and the CIA, along with their military allies, have armed and enabled tens of thousands of terrorists to lay waste that country. I led a delegation to Syria a year ago and met with Syrian President Assad, and he said, the fire you start here is going to burn in your countries, and it is. That's what these terrorist attacks are doing. The terrorists aren't limited to the Middle East. They move freely around. That's what the United States has engaged in. Even as the US, having lost the effort to overthrow Assad, it's preparing to carve part of northeast Syria away to set up a regime that would be under the tutelage of the United States. The US is currently fighting wars in at least 7 countries: Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, Syria, Yemen, Pakistan. We can add South Sudan, we can add Somalia. We just heard that there were special forces in Niger. They're all over Africa. They're fighting wars all over the place. The war profiteers cheer. Everyone else weeps. Underlying the refusal to acknowledge the urgent need to quickly and massively move from fossil fuels to renewables, and underlying Trump's recent insults to the colonized people of Puerto Rico, and basically his ignorance of the people of the Virgin Islands. In the agony of surviving 2 terrifying hurricanes, it's a profound racism and white supremacy that he displays. Trump's campaign statements bragging of his mistreatment and disrespect of women, and his unwavering support for the neo-Nazi and the Ku Klux Klan rally in Virginia, has encouraged widespread violence of white supremacy and male domination. In the United States, people of color, which includes many immigrants and workers from the Caribbean and Latin America, and moral people everywhere, are justifiably horrified and angered by the statements and actions of this president. In Cuba, U.S. imperialism stole from Cuba 115 years ago and has occupied the land and sea called Guantanamo Naval Base since 1903. Everyone knows that in this base, the U.S. illegally houses and tortures prisoners captured since 2001 in the course of the various U.S. aggressions against Asia and the Middle East. Since 1959, the Cuban Revolutionary Government has demanded that the U.S. return this territory to sovereign Cuba, which all of us support. The U.S., as is well known and customary, refuses. Guantanamo is only one of up to 1,000 U.S. military bases on foreign soil. In the Caribbean and Central America, there are U.S. bases in Honduras, El Salvador, Aruba and Curacao, Antigua, Barbuda, Bahamas, Colombia, Costa Rica, and, as was pointed out, maybe some of the embassies that you have in Barbados and Jamaica may also be considered as military bases. Not the same kind, perhaps, but useful for military purposes. These bases are hubs for the projection of U.S. military power, intimidation of sovereign governments, spying, and sabotage. Recognizing this base is in danger and destabilize the world, the World Peace Council at its assembly in Brazil last November declared that it would establish a global coalition to close U.S. foreign military bases. Within the United States, the U.S. Peace Council has brought together a wide range of peace groups, and I presume you know that there are many, many peace groups in the United States. We are not united on many issues. Some that disagree on a number of issues, but are unified against foreign military bases. A unity statement contains these words: the closure of U.S. foreign military bases is one of the first necessary steps toward a just, peaceful, and sustainable world. The coalition is organizing a conference in Baltimore, Maryland, not very far from the U.S. Capitol, January 12th to 14th, to determine goals and actions. How do we make this happen? How do we help create this global coalition? How do we play a part, our part, an important part? One of the proposals will be that on February 23rd, which in our reckoning is the 115th anniversary of the seizure of Guantanamo by the United States, that on February 23rd, 2018, there be actions all across the country calling to close that base and return it to Cuba, and as a means of educating people to all these other horrible bases that need to be closed. Trump's actions reflect his impeccable self-aggrandizement and class greed and his reliance on the military. His cabinet is loaded with ruling class warriors from Wall Street and retired U.S. military generals, and his chief cabinet appointment, Secretary of State Rex Tillerson, slipped in easily and directly from the biggest oil corporation, ExxonMobil. One could not better define the military-industrial complex than listing Trump's cabinet. The banks, the oil giants, the armaments manufacturers drive U.S. imperialist policies. We here, and especially in the United States, must connect the dots and stand in the way. So where do we go from here? From the U.S. Peace Council perspective, we need to unify, we need to grow and activate the global peace movement. We must not allow even significant differences on some issues prevent us from coalescing on common ground. We salute the creators of this conference for their efforts to bring together the peace movements of the English-speaking Caribbean. We urge everyone here to join in building the global coalition against U.S. foreign military bases. We have to build peace brick by brick. May this conference and its attendees lead the way. Thank you.
Thank you. So Henry has left some time that could be used in a question and answer session.
In the United States, as you may guess, because the peace movement, not only is it the peace organizations are disunified, but peace is not on people's tongues. The peace movement is relatively small. How do we get this discussion going about war and peace? How to stop war and to create a culture of peace? So what we've done very concretely is we've gone to our city council in New Haven, Connecticut, where I live. It's called the Board of Alders. And we arranged with this board to hold a public hearing. This is relevant very much to the United States, but I think it applies elsewhere. We arranged for the Board of Alders to hold a public hearing, and in that public hearing we invited, with the support of the mayor, department heads to speak to what they could do with the extra money that would come to them if we cut $1 trillion military budget and divided that up so that the cities had money. Now, the United States is rich, but our streets have potholes, Our sidewalks are not repaired. Our schools, in particular in the cities, don't have enough money. Kids go to bed hungry. Millions of people don't have health care. We need to move from an oil energy, nuclear energy society to a sustainable wind and solar and water. So these things need to be done. Infrastructure needs to be repaired. Dams, bridges, water system, sewer system. All of these things aren't being done. And we challenge these department heads to say what you could do with extra money. And so the department head from Public Works spoke about how they could repair public aspects of the city, the streets and the sidewalks. The head of Human Services spoke about how Human Services, we could provide housing for people. We wouldn't have to have homeless people. We wouldn't have to have people living in substandard housing. We could provide vaccines for kids in school, because some kids don't get medical treatment and health care. We could do those things, and I could go on. So we had that public hearing, and these department heads spoke to what they could do with the extra money. It's very concrete. And actually, some of them said, which I was surprised about, some said, I welcome the opportunity to be able to imagine what a wonderful job I could do if I had enough money to do my job. And then the Board of Alders took up the resolution that we had drafted, which said, cut the military budget and put that money into human needs, and they passed that. And the mayor took that resolution, the mayor of our city took that resolution, and to the U.S. Conference of Mayors, all the mayors in the United States of cities over 30,000, and they voted unanimously to pass a resolution calling to cut the U.S. military budget and put that money to human needs. These are Republican mayors and Democratic mayors. They're all of them. All of the mayors are suffering, or their cities are suffering. So a number of other cities are taking up this case around the country. And so Charlottesville, Virginia, where this neo-Nazi and Ku Klux Klan rally, they passed a resolution. And Ithaca, New York passed a resolution. And a county in Maryland passed a resolution. And cities in New Hampshire and elsewhere have passed these resolutions. It gets the conversation started. It puts the local leaders, the local politicians who think it's the responsibility of our congressmen and senators to deal with security, national security, so-called, and military issues. It says local leaders also have the responsibility, especially when the national leaders are not. Our national leaders just voted $80 billion more for the military budget, $700 billion officially, over $1 trillion in reality, every year. So that local leaders now have the obligation, they realize they have the obligation as leaders, as citizens, to start putting pressure on our national government to cut the military budget. So I think that's one of the things that we're doing very concretely. We're creating a movement in the United States to bring it down to the city and town level.
Yes, sir. You can go ahead.
Thank you. You mentioned a few nations where America is at war with. I was at war in some of those nations. And I want you to I'm going to refer to Black's-Law Dictionary 1950. It refers to a term in law called free white person. Free white person is the Naturalization Act as amended July 14th, 1870, has meaning when first naturally given to it in Sat 1, 103, C3, meaning all persons belonging to the European races now commonly counted as white, and their descendants, including their descendants in other countries where they may have immigrated. And it gives you a full description. And when you look at it, the nations that you talked about, those nations are not considered free white. And it has to do with your nationality and the position at the time of 1870, which is only 5 years after slavery in America, 1865. So if you go through that, and it will tell you that it does not mean Caucasian race, Aryan race, or Indo-European. They even court decisions to tell you which is considered and which isn't. So all those nations that you talked about on the other side of the Middle East, those are not included, so they can always be at war with them for any reason that they want. And the other ones are excluded from that. And you will see that is included, is based upon nationality and not race. I think you may know that term. Thank you.
And bear in mind that we only have about another 4 minutes or so for the discussion.
I'll try to speak fast. My brother, I'm very happy to know that you are here in Barbados, but I would like to hear you, relating to or speaking directly to the peace movement action as it relates to defending the people of the Americas, especially when it comes to the attacks against Venezuela from the United States of America, against Cuba, against Nicaragua, against Bolivia, against Ecuador, and against countries that are fighting for freedom, fighting for working class rights. I would like you to speak more directly to that in terms of what are the action and activities of the U.S. Peace Council, because I think this council is very, very important for us in this hemisphere in terms of helping us to fight the belly of the beast. And the other thing is that I think that action against the United States of America in relation to the Democratic People's Republic of Korea is very, very important, because any strike against Korea can create serious, serious, serious problems, okay, for us, because the Korean people are not prepared to allow what had happened in the 1950s to happen again to them, and I think that they're prepared to defend their country. That is why that every time there are military exercises between South Korea, United States of America, and Japan, the Korean people make sure that they let the world know that they are strengthening their military might, because they're willing and they're preparing themselves to defend their nation, which is the DPRK.
I think that will have to be the last question. You answer.
I don't think there's an easy answer to either of those. Those are very profound issues. Let me first deal with the first question, which is how do we build a movement to stop the United States from doing what it's doing to crush the Bolivarian Revolution, to crush the sovereign decisions of the nations of the Caribbean and Latin America. I see formal and informal ways of doing this, ways of pressuring governments to speak up. The Organization of American States, the governments, have to speak up at the organization and be very firm and call out the United States for what it's doing and say, you have to stop, you're violating the organization's charter and you're violating the UN and the international law. I think that's one of the things that the Caribbean nations can do. How you get your governments to do that is a challenge to you, that they have to speak not so diplomatically. They have to be very direct. That's something that we have to do in the United States through the peace movement, because obviously we can't get our government to take a position that supports international law when it wants to violate it, which is much of the time. In terms of outside of the government, there are organizations that take the lead. And they build on all of the things that we're used to doing, which is demonstrations, conferences, lobbying with our legislators to oppose U.S. policy in this direction. There are no silver bullets here. We know how to do this. Can we be successful? My answer to that is we have to. We have to do what we can to support, to be in solidarity with the people of Venezuela and Cuba. We have no choice. That's what we have to do. We don't have to get people to agree. We don't have to get people to agree that they like those governments. We have to agree, we get people to agree that the United States does not have the right to overthrow those governments, because those are the governments that the people want in those countries, it's not up to the United States. I think that this issue of sovereignty that David raised is absolutely critical. It's critical to international law. It's critical to everything we do. In terms of North Korea, DPRK, I hate to use fear as a way to motivate people. I don't think it works very well, but in this case, the people of the United States have to know that, and I think this is what the leadership of North Korea is banking on, and it may be a bank that may not work, is banking on scaring the people of the United States. If you attack us, we're going to attack you back. That gets turned on its head by the media. The media's tried to convince us that the leadership of the DPRK is irrational, as we saw with Saddam Hussein and Muammar Gaddafi and Assad. I mean, we turn them into demons, they're irrational, and therefore we can do anything we want, according to the foreign policy people. So this is a struggle, a major effort we have to make in the United States, this education and countering the propaganda. It's very difficult, but we have to do it. And I think we have to do it person by person, organization by organization. As I mentioned, there's a lot of movement in the United States on the environmental issue. And the U.S. Peace Council joins. We participated in a major march a year ago in New York City, calling on the United States to join the environmental movement in a big way. But the environmental movement hasn't yet joined the peace movement. We join in the labor movement when there's a strike, when there's demand for better wages and better conditions and so forth. But the labor movement, only small parts of the labor movement, because there are some important parts, U.S. Labor Against the War is one of them, have joined the peace movement. We work with women's movement on women's health, but getting the women's movement to join the peace movement. So these are the issues. The peace movement affects everybody. It's not a civil rights issue, it's a human survival issue. How do we reach out to our colleagues in these other movements in a way that they understand that their survival depends on taking some of their time and putting it to peace issues? We haven't solved that riddle, but we're working on it.
We want to thank Henry Lowendorf for a very stimulating presentation, very stimulating questions as well. Thank you. Okay.